I want to talk to you this morning about a servant's heart. I told you last week that I had lost 10 friends in 1 year, and one of those was my friend Doug, who, in addition to being my friend, he had been my minister for many years. I love the whole Votah family. They all have a very special place in my heart. A couple of months ago, I was able to go and visit Doug's wife, Ann, his daughter, Mickey, and his granddaughter, Delaney. While I was there, Ann very graciously let me have copies of some of Doug's sermons that had been on his computer. Some of them were audio files, and some were Word documents. More than one of them were on serving. So I paid special attention to those this week. In one of these sermons, Doug had apparently counted how many times the word servant or servants appears in Scripture. Now, I haven't counted them myself, but Doug states that the word servant appears 428 times in the Bible. Servants appears another 445 times. So God intends for his people to be servants. Now, I'm sure that if you stop and think about the people in your life that have really stood out as being strong Christians, one of the characteristics that they have in common is that they had a servant's heart. It's one of the things that sets the Christian apart from the world. So what is the definition of a servant's heart? Well, I found a couple of really good definitions on the internet that from different Christian bloggers that I thought were scripturally sound and really good. The first is to help others in love without expecting something in return, serving in appreciation of the gifts God has already given us. The second one was very similar, and it said, having a servant's heart means to not only put others' needs ahead of our own, but to serve with the right motivation. And that is to put God's will first. Rewards, recognition, or even gratitude cannot be the motivation to live out true servanthood the way Jesus did. I thought both of those were pretty good. When he was asked what the greatest commandment was, Jesus replies, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." And that's from Matthew 22:37 through 40. Notice that he didn't stop after answering the question that was asked. We would all agree, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind is the greatest commandment. But I think he added the second part to give us a practical way of actually showing that we do love the Lord. And not showing each other, showing God that we love him. We are willing to follow his example. From his first miracle of turning water into wine to the Last Supper, Jesus shows us over and over that we are here to serve. John 13 describes the Last Supper and includes the scene where Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. A few of the things that I want you to think about here is Peter recognizes that Jesus was doing something that only servants did. And he didn't want Jesus to wash his feet. Jesus was their leader. He shouldn't be washing their feet. When Jesus told Peter that if he didn't let him wash his feet, then he would have no part in his kingdom. And Peter's response was basically, "Oh, I don't want that. Please wash my hands and my head too." Peter is kind of an extreme personality. But Jesus tells him that he's already had a bath, so he didn't need another one. He just needed his feet to be cleaned. So when we're serving, we shouldn't just meet the actual, or we should just be meeting the actual need, not every little desire. And sometimes the person who has the need might not want you to meet that need. Maybe due to their pride, or maybe because they think so much of you that they don't think you should lower yourself to serve them. But we still should serve. When I was taking care of my mom, I washed her feet every day. So I've given a lot of thought to this particular act. When you wash someone's feet, you are either kneeling or sitting in front of them in a perfect position to be knocked in the head or kicked in the teeth. You're making yourself vulnerable. You're putting yourself at risk. There is a risk of getting hurt when you serve. And to that point, Jesus washed the feet of Judas that night too. Think about that. He washed the feet of the one he knew was going to betray him that very night. I told you I was tired. The whole tongue-tied. This was one of the very last things that Jesus did before he was crucified. He wanted to show his disciples one more time how they were supposed to treat one another, that they were supposed to have a servant's heart. Over and over again, the Bible tells us to serve. 1 John 3:18 says, "Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." Galatians 5:13 and 14 says, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge in the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one commandment: love your neighbor as yourself." So what does this kind of service look like? When does it begin and when does it end? Well, remember that the second definition of a servant's heart that I gave you was having a servant's heart means not only to put others' needs ahead of your own, but to serve with the right motivation. And that is to put God's will first. Rewards, recognition, or even gratitude cannot be the motivation to live out true servanthood the way Jesus did. When my mom's mom, my granny, was 15 years old, neighbors of theirs came down with a deadly and very contagious disease. Granny volunteered to go and take care of them. You see, there were several children in the family, and the mom and dad were both sick. She put others' needs ahead of her own. But she didn't stop there. Before she actually went to their house, she knew that she would at least be quarantined and might get sick and die. So she walked to town and took out a life insurance policy naming her parents as the beneficiaries, because she wanted to make sure that if anything happened to her, that her parents were taken care of. She was only 15, but she was able to serve. Obviously, since I'm here now, she survived that, because she didn't get married until she was 21, and she was 28 when she had my mom. So the form of ministry, though, often changes as we go through different periods of our lives. Throughout her life, my granny served others. She had many different ministries. And the way we serve can and does change over the years. You may be sitting there thinking, gee, I can't get out, or I don't have any special talents, or some other excuse. My granny didn't drive, and she couldn't walk far when she was in her 70s and 80s. But every day, she had a list of people that she called to make sure that they were okay. If she didn't get an answer, she would try again in 10 or 15 minutes, just in case they were, in the bathroom or something. If she still didn't get an answer, then she would call someone else and send them over to actually go to the person's house and check on them. My grandmother, my other grandmother, my grandma, was the recipient of one of those visits and was very grateful. You see, she had fallen, and she would have just laid there all day if my granny had not sent my Uncle Frank over to check on her. And Uncle Frank picked her up out of the floor. Actually, he broke into her house first because it was locked. But then he picked her up out of the floor, and she was able to go on about her day. She wasn't hurt, she just couldn't get up. That right there is a ministry. That's a mission. I have a friend who lives with her mom in the house that they lived in when we were growing up. A few years ago, she told me that they had discovered their floor was in bad shape. Now, I'm not talking cosmetically with scratches and dings. I'm talking it needed new supports. They were really fortunate that they didn't fall through the floor. The whole thing needed to be replaced. And then she shared with me that people in her church had come over and fixed the floors. And I think they even replaced the roof because it wasn't in much better shape. That congregation had servants' hearts, and they were seeing to the needs of people. When I lived in Little Rock, there was a widow in the church there who needed a new roof, and the men in the church who were able showed up and supplied the labor that she needed. Now, serving doesn't have to be something big like fixing a roof or floor. Several years ago, when my car overheated, I had just moved to the area, and I was passing this church. My car overheated, and I pulled into the parking lot. Maureen was giving a violin lesson, and when it was over and my car had cooled down, she helped me put water in the radiator and then followed me home to make sure that I got there safely. Marie has challenged us to bring peanut butter for the food bank. Mike has asked before that we bring clothes, and then he takes our clothing donations and gives it to the homeless in the area. My friend Doug drove from Little Rock to Hot Springs, which that's about 50 miles, when I lived in Johnson City, and I had called him to ask him to put my dad on the prayer list. I didn't ask him to go visit my dad. I just asked him to pray. Not only did he go, but he called another minister friend of mine named Mike Rathbone, who lived in a town called Murfreesboro, Arkansas, which was also about 50 miles from Hot Springs in the opposite direction from Little Rock. He called to tell him, and Mike drove to Hot Springs to visit my dad and check on my mom. See, they knew I was too far away, and although they were both over 50 miles from Hot Springs, they knew it was closer than the 750 that I would have to do. Having a servant's heart means meeting needs, putting others before yourself. And one last thought, Matthew 28:18 through 20 says, "Then Jesus came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age.'" He tells us to teach them to obey everything I have commanded you, and a big part of that is serving. My friend Joni is a missionary with Pioneer Bible Translators, and she and her husband are stationed in Papua New Guinea. She spoke at a ladies' retreat a few years ago and talked about the Great Commission. One of the things that she pointed out was that we're all commanded to go. Some of us are supposed to go across the street or next door. Some of us might go to another state. I moved here from Arkansas. Some of us may go to a foreign country, but we are all told to go. We are all told to serve, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. If being a servant enables God to use you to make a real difference in the world, then shouldn't you be a servant? Without Jesus' willingness to take upon himself the form of a servant and become obedient even to death on a cross, there is no way you could have salvation.